In this video, we are going to build a very simple weather app that is going to retrieve data using an API, which stands for an Application Program Interface, to get weather data and then display it on our JavaScript page. So there are a number of steps involved, so let's get started discussing this. First of all, I want to go over a few concepts. So there are a lot of ways to register events in JavaScript, and I'm going to show you a new way here that you can add an event listener to an element and have a function that gets called when that happens. So we've been mostly using the click event, but there are some others as well. And so I'm going to show you that. Now, the other thing, we're going to have to understand JSON, which stands for JavaScript Object Notation. This is a format for data. What's important about it here to recognize is curly brackets represent an object, square brackets represent an array. And so this element data is an object here that has 6 components. It has a name, which is John Doe. It has something called vehicles. These are keys and then values. And vehicles is an array that has 2 objects inside the array. It has something called married, which is false, previous customer, known associates, notes. So these are all different components. This is going to be important when we actually start referencing our data in JSON. We'll come back to that when we see that. Now, we are doing asynchronous JavaScript and XML. That's what Ajax stands for. It's a way of getting data from a server using an API. And there are some very specific steps that we have to follow. But first of all, let's take a look at how do we find an API and get data from it. So the API that we're going to be using, and if you ever just want to try to find an API for something, for example, if I wanted to find something that gives me the joke of the day, API jokes, and I can probably find something here, okay? So this is a weather API, OpenWeatherMap.org. This API requires you to register and get an API key, but I'm going to put a link to a key for you here. When you want to find information, you need to go to the API link here so we can understand how to use it. What I want is current weather data. So I'm going to the API doc, and I want to get data by zip code. So I'm scrolling down here and I can see data by zip code. So let's look at what this API call looks like. The first part of this is typically referred to as your endpoint. It's basically the URL for this server. And then you see there's a question mark, and then you've got zip equals, and we'll put in a zip code. And then you have API, app ID, and you have to put in an API key. So it shows you here the parameters that are required. And here's an example of a call, and it shows you the data that is returned. So this data is returned as a JSON object, right? So we're going to be looking at all of this as we go through our app. So let me show you, let's start doing some coding here. So I've got VS Code over here, and what I've done so far, this is my index.html. So here's the page. So notice all I have is, I'll push this over, is a header, and I've got a paragraph here, enter your zip code to get the weather forecast. I've got this text box input. I've got a button that I click when I want to get the forecast, and I have a div here, which is going to be an area where I can display the weather information, right? So it's a pretty simple HTML page. I've got a link to a style sheet that just has a background color and font family. And here's my JavaScript page, and all it does right now, we always start with use strict and make sure that it's connected. So if I save over here, you see that alert comes up. So I know that everything is good. Okay, so you'll notice over here, I did not put an on click to set up what to do when this button is clicked. I'm going to set that up in JavaScript. So this button has an ID called forecast. And so what I'm going to do over here is I am going to create, I'm going to add my click handler for the forecast button. So I'm going to say document, get element by ID, forecast, dot, add event listener. Notice the capital letters. The event that I want to register is when you click this button. And when you click this button, I want you to call a function that I'm about to write called GetData. Notice when you do on click, then you have to put GetData in quotes and the parentheses afterwards. In this syntax, you do not. So you just put the name of the function. So when you click this button, we're going to call this function called GetData. So let's set up our GetData function. And to test that out, what we're going to say is console.log forecast clicked. Let's see if the connection has been made, right? So I'm going to save all, go over here, click the button, and you see in my window here, it says forecast clicked. So this line sets up that when you click that button, you go to this function, okay? So now, when I click this function, what do I want to do? The first thing I need to do is get the zip code. You always have to tell yourself, what is it that I need to do? So where's the zip code? The zip code is going to be in this text box that has an ID of zip code, right? So I'm going to say let zip code, this is going to be a variable, equals document get element by ID zip code dot value. Remember to get something from a text box. Let's make sure it worked. Zip code is, because if this doesn't work, nothing else is going to work. Right? So I put in a zip code in here, 94555, click. Zip code is null, so something is not quite right. Oh, you see what happened? It clicked and changed this to node value. I just want value, right? All the more reason that we have to test when we're doing things. So 94555, click. All right, so we have the zip code in this variable called zip code, okay? Now, I could put all the rest of the code in here, but I just like to partition my code into sort of multiple pieces. So I'm going to write a function here called getWeather that receives as input a zip code. Now notice I don't have to use the same variable name. And I'm going to say this function retrieves or sets up Ajax call to get weather for this zip. So I'm going to call this function. So get data, remember we click the button, we call get data gets the zip code, and now we're going to call the function to do the work. So I'm going to call get weather, and I'm going to pass it zip code. These could be the same names, but I'm using different names so you're clear about what's going on. So this is a call to this function, and I'm going to show you that the data is being passed because I'm going to print out what zip is here. And we're going to see that the data has been passed. So I'm going to save all, put in 94555, get forecast. So look, we got the information from the text box. I console logged it here. That zip code is 94555. I called this function, passed its zip code. So for whatever was in zip code went into this variable called zip. So zip has the same data in it. Okay. Now I need to set up my URL to request the data. So I've got this endpoint, and I'm going to let endpoint equals, and I have this from the documentation, right? And I'll make sure and post this so you can see it. So that is from the documentation there. If I go back over to here, you see this part, API openweathermap.org/data/2.5/weather. So that's the first part of the URL. Okay. I have an API key here. You can register for your own. To get your API key, you would go over here and you would register to get an API key. Okay, but I have one already, and so I'm going to just put that one in here. I'm going to use a constant for that because it's not going to change. So that's going to be another part of what I need. So now I need to create my URL. So I'm going to have this variable let URL equals, I need this endpoint. I need to glue onto that the question mark. Again, look over here. Let's go back and look at what we have here. So where's my zip code here? Right? That, and you see the question mark right there? So I have to add that in. Question mark zip equals question mark zip equals. So that's that part. And then I also need these units. This is another part of what I need. So I have to add in my zip code. Zip equals, and we'll have to add in my zip code, which is in zip, right? Plus, I also need a few more things. I'm copying this from some other code here. Okay, let me break this out so we can look at it. The complete URL is this endpoint, which is this. I glue onto it, question mark zip equals. I glue the zip code on. I glue into some other information here from the documentation, and I glue into my API key. So let's look at that. Console.log URL is. You've got to make sure that this thing is correct, because if it's not, then nothing's going to work. All right, so do you see here? Here is my URL, and I'm going to show you another little trick here. If I can grab, you can click on it. So that's wonderful. If I click on that, that is a URL. And you notice if you put that URL into the browser, then this is the data that is being returned. So that is what we are doing in the browser. If I wanted to change this to a different zip code, you'll notice that right now the city down here is Fremont. But if I put in, instead of zip equals 94555, if I literally go here in my browser window and put in a different zip code, then you'll see I get data from a different city. So this proves to me, first of all, that I constructed my URL correctly, because if I didn't construct it correctly, then there's going to be problems. So you have to troubleshoot to this point. All right, so now we're going to set up our request. And there are several steps that you need to do in this order. the first step is I need to create an object. I need to create an XML HTTP object. So let XHR, and you could call it something else, but that's just typical in a lot of textbooks. That's what's used. New XML HTTP request. Okay, this is just magic that you have to know in terms of syntax. Now, I need to set up action when data is returned. So I need to say XHR, I need to add an event listener. There's an event. When the data is returned from this request, it generates an event called load. And when the load event happens, I want you to call this function. I'm going to call this function response handler. That's a function that we're about to create. Okay, that's not some function that already exists. All right, then required for JSON is this next line, xhr.response. So you have to look at your documentation to know. Typically the data comes back as JSON data, but not always. All right, then I need to open the connection. So I'm going to say xhr.open, and it's a GET request, and I pass it the URL that we created. And then I need to send the data. So all these steps are important and have to go in this order. xhr.send. Right? Now, down here, I need to create this function, my response handler. So function response handler. This function is called when data is received. Okay? And we need to check and see if a response was returned. We have to check the status. If this dot status is equal to 200, that means data was received. Okay? And we're going to say else there was a problem. We're going to have to put an error message. Okay, let's work on data received because I know I have a good query over here. So the first thing that we want to do is look at the data that gets received. So I want to console log this dot response. That is always how the data is received, into something called this dot response. So let's stop here, take a little look and see what's going on. So put in a zip code, get forecast. All right, there's my URL. So we sent the connection. We got here. I know I got here because look, I'm getting this data returned. So that means we got data received, the status was good, and this is the response. So look, if I click on this, I can see the JSON that is in here. So all of this data was retrieved as an object. Now let's say I want to print out the name of the city, right? So do you see this object has all these different components, and one of the components here is name, and this is the name of the city. To make it a little easier so that I don't have to type this dot response over and over again, I'm going to say constant data equals this dot response. I just won't have to retype that part over and over again. All right. Then I'm going to say console log city is data dot, let's go look again, name. Okay, so this is a way I need to make sure that I am referencing this information correctly. So let's see if that worked. So you see there? So that means I was able to retrieve this value by referencing this dot response, which I substituted as data, data.name. Okay. If I want the temperature, let's go look over here and see where the temperature is. So you see there's a component called main. Inside of main is an object that has temp inside of it. So we would have to go data.main.temp. Let's double check that. So I'm going to say console log temp is data.main.temp. So you have to log this stuff to see if you are referencing it correctly before you can put it on your page. And you have to read the JSON to find it. Okay, so I pulled out the temperature. Again, this is an object that has all these different pieces. One of the pieces is main. Main is an object that has pieces inside of it. So I reference it as data, which is this dot response, dot main, dot temp. Okay, let's get one more thing over here. There's a description of the weather. So here in this weather component, this weather is an array. And you see here's a description, clear sky. So if I want to reference that, that is data dot weather position 0 dot description. You can see it a little bit better over here. This whole thing, consider this whole thing as data dot weather position 0 in the array dot description. Okay, so let's check that out and see. Console.log description is data dot weather is an array, position 0 square brackets dot description. Okay, before I want to display any of this data on the page, I need to make sure that I can reference it. Right, so I have the city, I have the temperature, I have the description. So let's say that those are the three things that I now want to display on my page. So remember, I have a div here called weather info, and that's where I want to put that information. So I am going to construct a string that is going to have the information that I want to put in there. So I'm going to say let HTML equals, I'm going to make a p tag, and we're going to say city. And where was my city? In here, data.name. That's why it's useful to do that. Plus p. Oops. All right, let's just see if we can display the city. So we're going to put in the div. So I have document get element by ID weather info. Let me make sure that that's the way I spelled it. Yes, with a capital I. Dot inner HTML equals HTML. So let's see if we can just get the city displayed. Again, this is the way you do these things. You have to do them one step at a time to make sure. So look, I've got the city. Okay. So let's add on to this HTML plus equals, and we want to put the current temp. So that's another P, current temp. And remember, this was my temp. Close my P tag. I'm feeling pretty good, so I'm going to go ahead and put the description in here. HTML plus equal. I'm gluing onto it. I'm making one long string with all of my HTML. And I'm going to put the description. I'm just going to put the description in there directly. And so I'm going to put this. right? And then all of that gets put in the div. So let's save all. 94555. And there you go. City, current temperature, and description. So however you want to format that, you'll be able to format that. Okay. Now, what happens if, I have an incomplete zip code? Well, we really want to clear this out, and we should have an error message in there instead. So remember, that was over here. If there's a problem, then I want to put an error message in here. So I'm going to put in here, and I'm just going to build this real quick right here. So P weather data unavailable. Okay, let's test that. So if I just put in, something like that, weather data unavailable, right? If I put in a good zip code, I think that might be a good zip code. Yeah. So that's Houston. There's the temperature. Might want to clear this out at the time that we do this. If we wanted to, we could do that. But again, if I put in something that is bad, then it clears out and says weather data unavailable, right? So again, to go through this code, there's not that much going on in here. We added a click handler for the forecast button. We tested that was connected. We got the zip code. We called this function getWeather to do the majority of the work. We pass it the zip code. In this function, we have to build this URL, which is this endpoint, which is the server name. I've got an API key, and then I have to add my query, zip equals, and I need some other things in here in the API key. Tested that my URL was correct. Now here come the steps to doing my Ajax request. I have to create a request object. I have to say, when the data comes back, I want you to go to this function, which we had to write. Since this is JSON data, this was required. I have to open the connection with the URL that I built, and then I have to send the data. When the data comes back, we check to see that we got 200, which is a good response. We first just look at our data so we can tell what it is. I just made this just for convenience, because otherwise here I would have had to type this.response.name, this.response.main.temp. So I just simplified a little bit there, right? We looked, make sure we pulled out the data that we wanted. Then I built an HTML string, which I displayed in that div on my page. Otherwise, if there's an error message, I put the error message in that div on that page. And we have a weather app, just that easy. So there's all kinds of APIs out there, and the key is to find an API like this joke API. If you want to do that, you have to go through, you have to read the documentation, see what it gets, what the endpoints are. Sometimes there's charges for these things, sometimes not. So you just have to look at what the information is. If you want to get the joke of the day, then you would use that. Here's some example code that shows you how to do it. Okay? Great. So make sure that that all makes sense.